The night the goose laid its first golden egg, Kofi was on his knees, weeping. He had been weeping for 3 days. His daughter, little Abina, 7 years old and the only child the gods had given him, and his wife Adwoa, was burning with a fever that no herb and no healer had been able to break. The village healer had shaken his head and packed his bag. The women who came to sit with Adwoa had stopped meeting her eyes. Even the eldest woman in the village, who had seen many things in her long years, had pulled Kofi aside and whispered to him gently, telling him to prepare his heart. But Kofi refused to prepare his heart. He sold his 2 goats. He sold the yams drying on the rack. He sold Adwoa's good wrapper that she kept folded in a cloth at the bottom of their wooden chest. He sent word to his brother in the next village and borrowed money. He had no idea how he would ever repay. He paid for a healer from a faraway town to come and look at Abina, and that healer took everything Kofi had left and said he would return in 3 days with medicine. 3 days passed, but the healer never came back. That was the night Kofi knelt in the dirt outside his home and wept. Adwoa sat inside beside their daughter, holding the child's small hot hand, singing softly. She had no more tears. She had finished her tears 2 days ago. All she had left was the song. It was in that heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that only comes when a family has run out of options, that they heard it. A strange sound from the shed at the back of their compound. It was not a cry of distress, not the flapping of wings in panic, but something else. Something they had never heard before. Kofi lifted his head. Adwoa stopped singing. They looked at each other. Kofi rose slowly from the ground and walked toward the shed with Adwoa following close behind him, still holding her wrapper tight around her shoulders against the cold night air. When Kofi pushed open the door of the shed, the smell of animals and hay filled his nose the way it always did. The other birds stirred and shuffled. But his eyes were pulled, almost against his will, to the corner where the goose sat. And there, beneath the goose, glowing softly in the darkness of the shed like a coal that had not yet gone cold, was an egg. But it was not white. It was not brown. It was gold. A deep, warm, unmistakable gold that seemed to pulse with its own quiet light. Kofi stood frozen in the doorway. Adwoa walked past him, knelt slowly beside the goose, and reached out. The goose allowed her. She picked up the egg with both hands, and the moment it sat in her palms, she let out a sound that shook her whole body. "Kofi," she whispered, but he was too stunned to speak. "Kofi, look at this." He walked forward as if in a dream and looked at what she held. They stayed like that for a long time, the 2 of them crouched in the hay, in the middle of the night, holding something that had never existed. Now, before we go further, if you are new here, please subscribe to this channel and turn on post notifications, because the stories we tell here will stay with you long after you hear them. And wait until you hear what happened next, because this is only the beginning. The goose had come to Kofi and Adwoa many years before, long before Abina was born, when Kofi was still a young man with quick feet and an open hand. He had been traveling back from the market one dry afternoon when he found an old man sitting by the road, struggling under the weight of a large bundle he was carrying alone. The old man's forehead was lined with sweat and his breathing was rough and labored. Every other person on that road had walked past him. Some had not even looked. Kofi had stopped. He had put down his own basket, helped the old man to his feet, carried the bundle on his own head, and walked with him for a long distance until they reached the path the man needed. The old man had no money to give. He had nothing but a goose wrapped in cloth, which he pulled forward and pressed into Kofi's hands with a firmness that surprised Kofi given how tired the man had appeared moments before. "Take it," the old man said. "Care for it well. And never, for any reason, treat it badly." Kofi tried to refuse, but the old man insisted. By the time Kofi turned to say something more, the man was gone. It was as if he disappeared into thin air. Kofi had brought the goose home. It was an ordinary-looking bird in every way, gray and white with a long neck and small watchful eyes. Adwoa had received it with curiosity and immediately made a place for it in the shed alongside their other birds. Years went by. Every other bird in that shed laid eggs. The hens laid. The guinea fowl laid. Even the one duck they had eventually laid eggs, but the goose laid nothing. Neighbors talked, just like it is the way of neighbors to talk. "That goose is eating your grain for nothing," one man said. "Kill it and eat it," said another. "At least it will give you one good meal." A woman from down the path once said to Adwoa, loudly enough for the whole compound to hear, "You are too soft. That bird is useless." Any sensible person would have gotten rid of it long ago. Adwoa had looked at the woman calmly and said, "It is not a burden to feed something that cannot feed itself. I will not treat it badly for something that is not its fault." Kofi had said even less. He simply continued to feed the goose, made sure it had water, and checked on it each evening. If the goose sensed any resentment from him, he never showed it. He treated it exactly as he treated the others, no differently, no worse. And the goose, for all those years, simply lived. Quietly. Watching and laying nothing. Until the night their daughter was dying. The next morning, Kofi and Adwoa wrapped the golden egg carefully in a cloth and went to the market. They did not know what to expect. They were afraid, even, of how people would react. But the moment Kofi unwrapped the egg at the market, everything stopped. People crowded around them. Traders leaned in from their stalls. Children pressed forward on their toes to see. "What is this? Where did it come from? Is it real?" A merchant from a distant town pushed through the crowd, examined the egg with careful eyes, turned it over in his hands, pressed it gently, and looked up at Kofi with an expression that mixed awe with the controlled calm of a man who negotiates for a living. "I will buy it," the merchant said. The price he offered made Adwoa grip Kofi's arm. They paid their debt that afternoon. They paid the borrowed money. They paid everything. And when they came home that evening, they found Adwoa sitting up in bed, her fever gone, and she was asking for food. Adwoa sat beside her and wept out of gratitude. But the goose did not stop at one egg. The next morning, Kofi went to the shed before the sun had fully risen, moving quietly so as not to wake Adwoa and Adwoa, who were still sleeping soundly, Adwoa for the first time in weeks, without the restless turning and whimpering of fever. He pushed open the shed door, and there it was again. Another golden egg, sitting beneath the goose in the hay, glowing with that same warm, quiet light that had stopped his breath the first night. He stood there for a moment, just looking at it. Then he picked it up carefully, walked back to the house, sat down on the low wooden stool outside his door, and held it in both hands as the sun began to climb. He did not shout. He did not run through the village announcing what had happened. He simply sat with it, the way a man sits with something sacred, understanding without being told that some gifts must be handled with a certain kind of quietness. The day after, there was another egg. And the day after that, another. Every single morning, without fail, one golden egg. Always one. Never two, never none. Just one, steady and certain as the sunrise itself. Within a month, Kofi had repaired his roof. Within 2 months, Adwoa had a new wrapper, and the good wooden chest had been replaced with one that did not creak. Within 3 months, Kofi had hired 2 young men to help him on his small farm, and the farm itself had expanded. Within 6 months, people who had once walked past Kofi's compound without a second glance now slowed down as they passed. They noticed the new walls. They noticed the full granary. They noticed the way Adwoa ran and played with a healthy brightness that made older women smile and say the gods had been kind. Kofi never boasted. Adwoa never changed either. They still greeted their neighbors the same way, still sat with elderly people in the evening, and still gave food to those who asked. The only difference was that now they had food to give. But news is a living thing in a village. It moves on its own. It grows as it moves. And the news of the golden eggs, by the time it reached the ears of the village head, Nana Achempong, had grown into something large and glittering and impossible to ignore. Nana Achempong was not a poor man. He had never been poor. He had lands, cattle, a large compound with many rooms for wives, and more yams in his storehouse than his household could eat in 2 dry seasons. He was respected, and he knew it, and he wore that respect like a second skin. But there was a particular kind of hunger that lived inside him, a hunger that had nothing to do with food or genuine need. It was the hunger of a man who could not stand to see something precious in the hands of someone he considered beneath him. When his messenger brought him the story of Kofi and the goose that laid golden eggs daily, Nana Achempong sat very still for a long time. Then he said, "Bring the man to me." Kofi came. He sat across from the village head in the large meeting room of his compound, and he answered every question calmly and honestly. Yes, the goose laid 1 golden egg every morning. Yes, he sold them at the market. No, he did not know why it had started. Yes, he had owned the goose for many years before it laid anything. Nana Achempong leaned forward. "Sell it to me," he said. It was not quite a question. Kofi met his eyes. "I cannot, Nana. With respect, I cannot sell it. I will give you a good price." "Name it." "It is not about the price," Kofi said carefully. "This goose was given to me as a gift. I have kept it and cared for it for many years. I do not believe it is mine to sell." The village head's express shifted. Not anger yet, but the thing that comes just before anger, when a powerful man realizes that a simple man is not going to fold the way he expected. "You may go," Nana Achempong said quietly. Kofi went home and told Adwoa everything. Adwoa listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said, "We must be careful now." She was right to say so because 3 nights later, Kofi was woken by shouting in his compound. By the time he rushed outside, 4 of the village head's men were already in the shed. 2 of them held torches. One of them was carrying the goose, gripping it firmly around the body despite the birds struggling and hissing. Kofi ran forward, but 2 men blocked him. He shouted. Adwoa screamed from the doorway, holding Abina back. Neighbors came out of their homes and watched from a distance, watching the way people watch when power is doing something wrong in the open, and they are afraid to say so. The goose was taken. Kofi stood in the middle of his compound long after the men had gone, breathing hard, his fists clenched at his sides. Adwoa came and stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Abina, who had slipped out of the room, came to stand beside her father. She reached up and took his hand. "Will the goose be all right, Papa?" she asked. Kofi looked down at his daughter. He swallowed. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I hope so." But inside Nana Achempong's large and well-kept compound, things were not all right at all. The goose arrived and was given the best shed on the property, better than anything it had in Kofi's humble home. It was fed well. Fresh water was brought to it twice a day. Nana Achempong ordered his servants to treat it carefully and give it everything it needed. He had convinced himself that the egg-laying was simply a matter of good conditions, and that under his roof, with his resources, the goose would perform even better than it had for a poor farmer. But on the first morning, there was no egg. Nana Achempong was told, and he frowned, but said nothing. "It needs time to settle," he said. The second morning, still nothing. By the 5th morning, the frown had deepened into something harder. He went to the shed himself and stood looking at the goose, which sat in the hay and looked back at him with its small steady eyes, completely unmoved by who he was or what he owned. "Why is it not laying?" he demanded of the servant standing behind him. The servant said nothing because there was nothing to say. By the 2nd week, Nana Achempong's first wife had begun to whisper to him at night. She was a practical woman with a practical mind, and she had never liked mystery. "That farmer is doing something," she said. There is something he knows about that bird that he is not telling you. That is why it lay for him and not for you. What do you suggest? Nana Achampong asked. Call him. Make him come and speak to it. Maybe it responds to his voice. Kofi was summoned. He came and stood in front of the shed and looked at the goose. The goose looked back at him. Unsaid words passed between them that no one watching could quite name. Kofi spoke to it softly in a low voice, the way he always had. He told it he was all right. He told it Adwoa and Abina were all right. He said nothing to ask it to lay. He simply talked to it the way you talk to someone you have known and cared for across many quiet years. The goose was still. It did not lay. A third week passed. Nothing. Nana Achampong's patience, which had never been his strongest quality, finally collapsed. He called his wives together and his most trusted men and said he needed counsel. His first wife spoke first, and she spoke plainly. I believe the gold is inside it, she said. Every egg it has laid, every bit of gold, it must all still be inside. Kill it, and we take everything at once. Why wait day by day for one egg when we can have it all tonight? The room was quiet. One of the men shifted uncomfortably. Nana, he said carefully, this is not an ordinary bird. Perhaps we should. I have decided, Nana Achampong said. That night, the goose was killed. They gathered around as it was opened. Every person in that room leaned forward with the particular wide-eyed greed of people who believe they are moments away from becoming rich. But to their shock, there was nothing. Nothing but what you would find inside any ordinary goose. Flesh, bone, and the unremarkable interior of a bird that had simply been a bird on the outside and, apparently, on the inside too. The silence that followed was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. Nana Achampong stared at what was in front of him for a long time. Then he stood up slowly and walked out of the room without a word. That night it did not rain. The night after, it did not rain either. Within a week, the farmers began to notice. And within 2 weeks, the river that fed the village had dropped to a thin, worried trickle. Within a month, crops that had been growing well began to wither and curl at the edges. The sky stayed hard and white and dry with the particular cruelty of a sky that has decided to withhold itself. Soon the village began to suffer more. It started with the animals. The goats stopped giving milk. The chickens stopped laying. Even the dogs, usually noisy and restless in the evenings, grew quiet and stayed close to the ground as if they too could feel that something had gone deeply, irreversibly wrong. The wells began to dry. Women who walked to the river every morning for water now came back with half-filled pots and worried eyes that said more than their mouths were willing to say out loud. Then the children started losing weight. That was when the village could no longer pretend. Nana Achampong called the elders together. He called the diviners. He asked them to find the cause and tell him what needed to be done. The diviners consulted and returned with grim faces. They said that something sacred had been destroyed, that a great wrong had been committed and the land was responding to it the way the land always responds to great wrongs, with silence, with withdrawal, with the kind of slow and patient punishment that does not shout but simply stops giving. What was destroyed? Nana Achampong asked. They told him what he already knew, deep in the part of himself he had been refusing to visit since the night he stood over the body of that goose and found nothing inside it. The elders looked at him steadily. You know what was destroyed, the eldest among them said. And you know whose it was. The diviners said that restoration would only come through the man from whom the bird was taken. That until that man's heart released what had been done to him, the land would not release its rain. The village would not heal. Nothing would grow. Nana Achampong, who had never in his adult life gone to the home of an ordinary man to apologize for anything, sent for Kofi. But Kofi was not summoned this time. The message that came to his door was different from the one before. This time the messenger came alone, without the hard eyes and straight back of official authority. He came quietly, And he spoke quietly, and he said that Nana Achempong was asking, not ordering, asking, if Kofi would please come. Kofi looked at Adwoa. Adwoa looked back at him for a long moment. Go, she said. But go as yourself. He went. When he arrived at the village head's compound, he was not taken to the large meeting room where powerful men sat on carved stools and spoke down at those who stood before them. Instead, Nana Achempong met him at the entrance. The village head looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 1 month. The flesh around his eyes was heavy. His wrapper was not as crisp as it always was. He stood in his own doorway with a posture Kofi had never seen on him before, the posture of a man carrying something he can no longer hold up. The elders were there. The 4 wives were there. Several of the compound's household were gathered at a respectful distance, watching. Nana Achempong looked at Kofi directly. He did not look away. I wronged you, he said, falling on his face. His voice was level, but it cost him something to keep it that way. I sent men to your home in the night and took what was yours. I took it by force. When it would not perform for me, I destroyed it out of greed and impatience. I have brought suffering to this whole village because of what I did. I am kneeling before you now to ask you, Kofi, to please forgive me. The compound was utterly silent. Kofi stood still for a moment. He thought about the night he had stood in his own compound with his fists clenched, watching his goose being carried away. He thought about Abina's small hand in his and her quiet voice asking if the goose would be all right. He thought about all the mornings he had gone to the shed and cared for that bird when it gave him nothing, not because he expected anything in return, but simply because it was the right way to treat something that was in his care. He exhaled slowly. I forgive you, Nana, he said. Completely. I hold nothing against you. The eldest elder closed his eyes briefly as if something had just been set down after a long journey. Nana Achempong nodded. He could not immediately speak. He pressed his lips together and nodded again. Kofi walked home. The evening was dry and still. The kind of stillness that feels like it is waiting. Adwoa was sitting outside with Abina when he returned, and she looked at his face and read it the way only a wife who has lived through hard things with a man can read a face. It is done, she said. It is done, he agreed. They ate a quiet meal and put Abina to bed and sat together outside in the dark for a while before going in to sleep themselves. It was an ordinary night. Or it seemed like one. It was deep in the night, the hour when everything is most still, that Kofi heard it. He sat up in bed immediately. Adwoa woke beside him. They looked at each other in the darkness, and without a word they both knew something was going on. He was already on his feet before he was fully awake, already moving through the house and out into the compound, Adwoa right behind him. He pushed open the shed door, and in the far corner, in the hay where the goose had always slept, there was a glow. Warm and golden and alive, the same light he had seen that first night when everything was desperate and his daughter was at the verge of death. He walked forward slowly and crouched down, and what he saw made his breath leave his body entirely. An egg. Golden, pulsing softly in the dark. And it was moving. A small but definite movement, a trembling from within as if something inside was turning itself, preparing, gathering the last of what it needed before it arrived. Adwoa, he whispered. She was already beside him, already on her knees in the hay. Her hand found his in the dark. They watched together as a small crack appeared in the egg. Then another. Then a tiny beak pushed through, then a small head covered in damp feathers, then the rest of the little body, trembling and new and impossibly alive, tumbling forward into the hay with the uncertain wobble of a creature that has just arrived in the world and has not yet decided what it thinks of it. It was a gosling, small and gray-white, already watching them with those same steady, unhurried eyes. Kofi and Adwoa stayed there a long time. He hid it, tucking it gently into a separate corner of the shed, covering it with soft hay, telling himself and Adwoa that they would take time before they told anyone. That they would protect it this time. That they would be careful. But when morning came and Kofi went to check on it before first light, he stopped at the entrance of the shed and his mouth opened. The gosling was gone. But in its place was a fully grown goose. Not a young bird still finding itself. A full adult, gray and white and upright, with a long neck and small watchful eyes exactly, precisely, in every particular, the same as the one that had been taken from him. It looked at him. He looked at it. Then, slowly, without any fuss, the goose lowered itself into the hay of its corner. And when it rose again moments later, beneath it sat a golden egg. Kofi pressed his hand over his mouth. His eyes filled with tears. He turned and walked back to the house with the egg in his hands. He woke Adwoa and put the egg in her hands, and they sat there in the early morning light together without speaking because there was nothing that needed to be said. Some things are beyond the reach of words, and this was one of them. That morning, as if the sky itself had been waiting for exactly this moment, the clouds came. They came from the east first, gray and heavy and full, rolling in the way clouds roll when they mean what they are saying. The villagers came out of their homes and looked up with the cautious hope of people who have been disappointed before and are afraid to believe too quickly. Children pointed. Women shaded their eyes and watched the sky. Then the rain came down. Not a drizzle. Not a hesitant sprinkle that stops before it has started. A full, generous, soaking rain that hit the dry ground and filled the air with that smell, that deep, rich smell of earth receiving water that the village had not known for too long. People stood in it. Old men walked out of their doorways and lifted their faces to it. Women who had been carrying half-empty water pots for weeks set them down and spread their arms. Children screamed and ran and slipped in the mud that was forming and laughed in the way children laugh when something wonderful and uncontrollable is happening. The river, by evening, was running full again. By the following week, the crops that had wilted began to show the first green signs of returning life at their edges. The goats gave milk again. The chickens laid. The dogs were noisy in the evenings once more. The village breathed. News of everything, the forgiveness, the new goose, the rain, spread the way true things spread, quietly and completely, until everyone knew and no one could say exactly who had first said it. Nana Achempong called Kofi to him again. This time there were no hard eyes and no borrowed authority in the air between them. The village head was a changed man, not transformed overnight into something he had never been, but quieted in a way that reshapes a person from the inside. He had looked at what his greed had nearly done to an entire village, and he had not looked away from it. He gave Kofi 3 large plots of fertile land at the edge of the village, the best land that flooded properly in the rains and held moisture in the dry season. He gave him cattle. He gave him resources enough that Kofi's family would not know lack again for a very long time. And he called the elders together and, in front of all of them, he gave Kofi a title, a chieftain's a title, a stool name, a seat among the respected men who helped to govern and protect the village. Kofi accepted everything with the same quiet dignity with which he had accepted hardship. He thanked the village head. He thanked the elders. He went home and told Adwoa, and they sat with Abina between them, and the child looked from one face to the other, sensing something large and good without being able to name it exactly. "Are we happy, Mama?" Abina asked. Adwoa laughed. "Yes," she said, pulling her daughter close. "We are very happy." And in the shed at the back of their compound, in the quiet of the evening, the goose settled into the hay with the unhurried certainty of something that has always known it is exactly where it belongs. Every morning after that, without fail, 1 golden egg. Not because of what it was worth, but because kindness, genuine and consistent and given without the expectation of return, always finds its way back. It always does. It may take longer than we want. It may come in a form we did not expect. But it comes. It always comes. If this story touched you or reminded you of something true, please like this video, leave a comment below telling us what you learned from the story, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story. We tell the kinds of stories that carry something real inside them, and there are many more waiting for you here. Thank you for watching until the very end. It means more than you know.